I'm Joshua Harris, Communication Director for the City of Lenoir, and today I'm talking with Police Chief Brent Phelps.
Hey Joshua.
How you doing?
Good.
We're going to talk about some police policies relating to the recent national push called the 8 Can't Wait.
Yes, sir.
And we want to give folks, some background on our police policies, what we do, and why we do what we do. So first, I guess I'll just go through the 8.
Okay.
I'm going to read the 8, and then we'll take them one by one.
Sounds good.
All right. So the first 8 can't wait is ban chokeholds and strangleholds. Number 2 is require de-escalation. Number 3, require warning before shooting. Number 4, requires exhaust all alternatives before shooting. Number 5, duty to intervene. Number 6, bans shooting at moving vehicles. Number 7, require use of force continuum. And number 8, require comprehensive reporting. So, Chief Phelps, let's talk about the first one, ban chokeholds and strangleholds. You want to tell us what our policy is on that?
Sure. We don't have anything in policy currently that addresses a chokehold or a stranglehold.
Okay.
Chokeholds and strangleholds restrict the airway, the airflow. And so essentially, this is the one of the 8 that we're looking at as far as we feel like there can be some improvement in our policy about adding some additional wording. Me and the captains and our leadership team have been working on this for the last week or so. But a chokehold that restricts airway, essentially the only time that would be permissible is in a deadly force type situation.
Yeah.
And so we are.
So when an officer is threatened and feels he needs to use deadly force, he could use a chokehold because that's deadly force.
Yes.
Per our policy now.
Yes.
Yeah.
We do currently have it's called a vascular neck restraint. It is a technique that officers can use. They have to be trained on it. Our policy states specifically the use of a vascular neck restraint by properly trained officers shall be considered a viable option when other methods of control and or defense have failed or are diminished. A vascular neck restraint in no way should affect the airway of the suspect.
My understanding is that restraint basically kind of cuts off your blood flow, right? Like on the side of your neck, and then makes you pass out.
Yes, that's correct. And so we are looking at that. We are looking at specifically that in our policy to try to determine with the need for our officers to use the right amount of force in certain situations, where we end up policy-wise with this. Mm-hmm. I've been in conversation with the League of Municipalities under their risk review assessment. We are in the process of that assessment and have been for the last year. I actually, by email today, got some potential wording from them. And so this is one we're looking at.
Do you think the vascular neck restraint, if done properly, is a good tool to have?
I do think that in certain situations, it is a tool for law enforcement officers to use to stop somebody's actions. And some of the alternatives to that can be more violent.
Like you mentioned at the council meeting, the other alternatives are
our fist, a baton, a taser, or potentially our weapon.
Yeah.
If we pull up, there's a male on top of a female, like in a domestic type situation, and he's choking her out, and the officer is not physically strong enough to remove him, if he doesn't stop that individual, he potentially could kill the female on the ground. And so it is a tool, it is an option, and I understand the community's concern. Does it look like a chokehold when done properly? It does. If somebody sees that, that's what they're initially going to think.
Yeah.
But it is one that we're looking at and trying to determine what is the right stance for our community and our officers to be able to do our job in the most professional way and safest way.
Okay. Well, let's move to number 2. So number 2 is require de-escalation, which I think is probably generally involved in almost all police training,
Yes.
but feel free to.
De-escalation is something we do on a daily basis. Pretty much our officers, by policy and practice, in every force scenario, we should be using de-escalation.
Right.
We should be attempting to have conversation, whether it's through a command or a direction, but we're trying to dictate for somebody to stop their actions.
Correct.
And so to be able to de-escalate that individual is vitally important. It's not new. This term seems to be a little newer in the last several years. I remember when I was a police explorer, before I got in law enforcement, I sat through a training class called verbal Judo. This type of practice for law enforcement has been around for decades.
Right. I mean, it seems, I would think that, the goal, which I'm sure you would say, for every police officer is always for the situation to de-escalate.
Absolutely.
Even if you have to, draw a weapon, the goal is always, hey, let's stop.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's stop the escalation and let's get back to the de-escalation.
Right.
And
our goal in any time we have an interaction is to not use force.
Right.
We don't want to use force, and the majority of the time we don't have to. We are able to either the citizens follow the instructions or request or even commands by the officer.
Do you happen to know the percentage of police interactions that end up in Lenoir, that end up with any kind of use of force? I assume it's small.
It is extremely small.
Yeah.
In 2019, our total police service calls was over 33,000.
33,000. Okay.
Now that is a wide variety. That's reports. That's responding to calls.
Sure.
That's all kind of different.
But those all count.
Yes, that's interaction with us and
Yeah,
citizens.
yeah.
And as a department, we only use force 61 times.
So yeah, I'm not good at math, but that's a pretty small number.
Right. And a part of
1% would be 3,300, right?
Right. And a part of those, and I'll explain and talk about it at the end, but a part of that number is the times that we document at our department when we point a weapon.
Right.
And so if we
Just
point a
pointing
weapon and we challenge somebody and I say, drop the bat, turn around, and they do that, and then I walk up and handcuff them, that still generates a report.
Right.
So out of that number, not all of those are us physically doing something.
Right.
And I'll talk about in the reporting of the
Okay.
8 that can't wait
Yeah.
a little bit about that. But yes,
Okay.
it's a very low number.
Yeah, very low. Which is a good thing for everybody
Absolutely.
involved, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I think we're on number 3.
Yeah.
Let's see, require warning before shooting. You talked about this one a little bit in the council meeting too, which I think, and obviously you made a lot of sense. So why don't you tell us the policy and then tell us what your thoughts are about this and why I think, as you said in the meeting, that's probably not always possible.
Right.
But
Our policy states that the force used by an officer shall be the minimum degree reasonably necessary under the circumstances at the time to overcome the suspect's level of resistance. Officers shall never use more force than is reasonably necessary at the time to control a suspect. If it is practical, if it is feasible, we should always give a warning.
Right.
By practice, with us just talking about de-escalation, we should always be attempting to settle it without having to use a weapon. But I'm not in favor. When you look at Campaign Zero and what the 8 that can't wait terminology on their website, they want that to be a mandate that you have to. Well, where that we should be doing it as much as practical, but there are some times where it is unfeasible to do that. I guarantee you, I've not seen any where we are not giving commands and verbal instructions, but the majority of shootings happen within like 3 to 5 seconds. The majority of shootings occur between 3 and 7 yards. It's very up close. It's very fast. and we are reacting.
Right.
When we are not initiating, we are responding to the actions of a citizen or a suspect, and our officers are catching up to what has already started to happen.
Right.
And so, for there to be a policy that mandates that has to happen, that's going to put officers in a place to where realistically that they probably can't obtain that in some situations.
Right. All right, let's go on to number 4, which is requires that officers exhaust all alternatives before shooting. That seems reasonable. Is it reasonable?
When you hear that, it does seem reasonable. And we hope that we are able to use our alternatives before shooting. And that's the goal. We want to do that. We don't want to have to shoot.
Right.
But for a policy to say you have to do this, 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 and this, as I said a minute ago.
In that 3 seconds between.
In that 3 seconds between where an officer and an individual engage, there may not be time. When you think about handcuffs, batons, pepper spray, taser, just some of the other things that we have as an option, there are not times. And for us to write a policy that says you will do all of these before, we're either going to put an officer in a situation where them or the public are going to get hurt. Because sometimes when we use force, it is to protect somebody else that something's happening to. Or we are going to be putting them in a situation where we know if they respond to protect themselves or a third party, they're going to be outside of policy.
Right.
And so that's not a good a practice. We should be working toward that alternative. But we have got to allow trained professional officers the right, one, to protect themselves from the assaults that occur to them and to protect the public from that.
This is one of those where, most of these, this sounds reasonable, but the question is always in the details where, well, what alternatives are you talking about? And how do you exhaust all those in particular situations that might not warrant it?
Right.
I mean, there's lots of other factors and scenarios where sometimes things aren't feasible.
With
and
policy,
aside from just shooting people, right? Sometimes there are things where, having a conversation about why you shouldn't be doing this might not be feasible at the time.
That's correct. With policy and even law, when you look at our policy and you look at North Carolina law, they're very broad. And I think there's a feeling from society right now is the policies should be very narrow and specific.
Yeah, so
to give the officers, to tell the officers you have to do this, this, and this. Well, the problem with that is the policy and or the law would have to encompass every scenario that could ever happen.
Right.
And that's just unreasonable.
Right.
And so we have to train our officers in the techniques, give them the tools, and then give them the ability to evaluate the totality of the circumstances and allow them in a professional way with the right training and guidance the ability to make those split-second decisions to protect themselves and other people.
And do what we can to try to inform the public again about our policies, about why officers do what they do.
It is a very tough place. I said this in an article in the paper the other day. It is a very tough place for officers. And officers have a hard job. And, I joke that I am in the office now more as the chief. But years ago, when I was on the road and interacting on a daily basis, it is a hard place when you're having to control somebody that doesn't want to be controlled and you're trying to do it without hurting them.
Right.
That is a very hard job for officers to do. And you take into account that officers are just people. We all have our own strengths and weaknesses. We all have our own abilities. We have some officers that are very big and very strong. We have some officers that, for their size, they may be strong, and
But if
most
you're-
of them are all in shape. But
If you're 150 and you're trying to
deal with somebody
a
that's
300-pound person
Right.
or 250, I mean,
right, and that's why you have to allow officers the ability to use all those things to control people if they will not follow those
Correct.
instructions.
And going back to that, the alternatives that you have, if you're 150, your options might be different than somebody that's
right.
200 pounds and
That's right.
built. So,
Yeah.
all right, let's move on to I think we're on number 5, duty to intervene.
Yeah.
Which I guess tell us what our policy. What did the 8 can't wait mean by that, and what is our policy?
What the 8 that can't wait, what they are requesting departments to have a policy that mandates officers to intervene and stop if they see excessive force being
All
used. And we have that in our policy.
All right, what's our
We have
policy?
for years. Our policy says officers of the Lenoir Police Department are required to intervene if a reasonable opportunity exists when they know that another officer is using excessive force. And along with, yes, right now that is a buzzword, duty to intervene, that has been federal case law for years. I remember officers from the Rodney King incident being federally charged for not intervening when excessive force was going on.
Yeah.
And convicted. They spent time in prison. And so this is a concept that professional law enforcement agencies, the majority have that in policy in some fashion. But this is a concept where, if it is excessive force, it is a crime. And so officers should intervene to stop that. Because at the point we are using excessive force, our legal authority to use force at all is gone.
So I know you can't get into the minds of other officers, and I know law enforcement officers never try to Monday morning quarterback situations because, it's hard to know what is going on.
It is.
But if you see a video and it looks like somebody's using excessive, I'm a citizen, I see a video and it looks like, hey, that's kind of excessive, and there's other officers that don't seem to think it's excessive. I mean, is that just what they're thinking? That's reasonable procedure? I mean,
obviously I can't answer for what those officers are thinking. I do think that's something that the public, they see a video and they form their own opinions of that video. In dealing with the public, in doing this profession for 2.5 decades, in reviewing use of force for our officers, I'll tell you that we always should look at the totality and review the entire incident before we rush to judgment on whether it was lawful, ethical, or moral. And the majority of departments, ours included, have a process in place for that to happen. Because when you see a 15-second clip on YouTube or from officers' body camera, there's a lot more to that than that 15 seconds.
Yeah.
And, we talk about it. We are straightforward about it. When we have to use force, unfortunately, that is not always a pretty sight.
Right.
And there is no way to make that pleasant.
Right.
When force is having to be used. As a department, it's our role, and as leadership in the department, it's our role to make sure that we followed policy, we followed law, and that and we did it in the right way.
And getting back to the duty to intervene, our policy requires that.
Yes.
So if there was a situation where officers didn't intervene, then
That's correct. That they would be, along with the individual that was, punished or disciplined for the excessive force, they would be disciplined as well.
Okay, let's see. I think we're on number 6. Ban shooting at moving vehicles. Yeah, tell us our policy. Okay. And you talked about this during the council meeting too, and I'm like, I don't know about that, but okay.
When you hear that, you think, well, that's reasonable to ban shooting at moving vehicles. In the wording on the 8th They Can't Wait website, it talks about that there should be a mandate policy always banning that from occurring. And it says that the majority of agencies have that action as prohibited, but they say that there are some loopholes that allow officers to do it. Well, we have in policy that it is prohibited. I'll just read you our policy and then tell you the other. Firing at a moving vehicle is prohibited except where the immediate probability of serious injury or death exists for a police officer and or an innocent third party if the officer does not do so. Before discharging a firearm at a moving vehicle, officers must reasonably believe that the only immediate means of protecting themselves and or an innocent third party is to use deadly force.
So, if a car is driving up toward a crowd of people, and you see that coming, you could reasonably fire at that vehicle to try to stop it from running into a crowd of people.
What I told council was the exceptions are exceptions, they're not loopholes.
Right.
When we have a trained officer that is equipped with those tools and somebody is using that vehicle as a deadly weapon, if it's feasible, we've got to allow that officer the ability to try to protect life.
So let's say,
whether it's their life or a crowd of people's lives.
You stop someone and the officer gets out of the car and they take off. Okay, well, you can't shoot at that vehicle.
No.
But if they turn around and start coming back toward the officer, you might could then.
Yes. And all that solely comes down to the officer, the officer's, the totality of the circumstances, and is the officer being able to articulate that his life or a third party's life was in danger, and if he didn't do this action, he may die, or third parties. And so there unfortunately are some people, and we have seen it across the world and even our country. Charlottesville, Virginia, that individual was using that vehicle to drive into the crowd. Without an exception, an officer would be standing there
breaking policy,
either breaking policy or standing there just as a citizen watching this happen. And so, I am not in favor for a total wide mandate. Is it prohibited the majority of the time by our policy? Yes, and it should be. But we have had specific legal training over the years where our legal advisors have told officers and discussed with officers that you cannot create the situation.
That puts you in harm's way.
That puts us in harm's way. If they create it and you can't escape it, that's one thing. But we cannot go and create that situation. We won't be covered.
So you couldn't jump in front of the vehicle. If the vehicle was coming, you can't run out in front of it and then say, hey, my life was in danger.
That's correct. And the majority of law enforcement have had that.
Most of this makes sense, right? It's common sense. You can't create a situation, but if there's a deadly situation, then you have to use what means you have. I think there's a little bit of I don't know, maybe it's a misunderstanding about, police policy is not, it's not like a short little manual, right? It's not like a short few pages.
No.
It's pages and pages.
Our use of force policy alone, just that one policy, is 21 pages long.
And I think sometimes it's unreasonable to try to condense that policy into these blanket. That's my personal opinion, but people have different opinions. So let's move on to number 7. Number 7, require use of force continuum. Okay, so tell us a little bit about that.
Our policy, what it states is that The Lenoir Police Department use of force options chart is a model to show the various use of force options available to trained officers for the effective and reasonable control of suspect resistance based on the suspect's actions and the officer's perception of
So we don't have a continuum
We
per
don't
se.
have a continuum, and the majority of law enforcement agencies went away from what is being talked about as a continuum and work off of something similar to this where it focuses on these are the things that you have been trained on as options, and it puts that articulation and decision making on that individual officer to use the correct amount of force to stop the suspect's action.
So why, and I know you mentioned in the meeting, the council meeting, why the continuum is not really, might not be the best option for the same reasonings as like exhausting all options. It may not necessarily be, a good way to handle things. The continuum implies like...
Right. The continuum implies that there's a step progression.
Right, yeah.
And you cannot mandate or by policy a specific progression because one, that progression, like we said earlier, may be different for different officers.
It's almost
based on their size, their ability, but also based on the suspect's actions. There's nothing in law that says once I pull my weapon, if I challenge them, I have to shoot. If they comply, then I de-escalate. Then I transition to a lower level. Hopefully they follow my commands. I'm able to holster my weapon and put handcuffs on them, and we process whatever the business is. And so...
What does the 8 can't wait, what do they mean by use of force continuum?
They just mandate that, from what I read, that all departments have a use of force continuum that is used.
First this, then this, then this.
Yeah, that's pretty much my understanding and what I read online. And so the chiefs that I've talked to and discussed some of these concepts with, nobody is in favor for going back to a continuum based on some of the reasons that we went away from it.
Okay. All right. We're at number 8. I'm not sure if I said the right numbers as we were going through, but we're at 8 now. So, and number 8 is require comprehensive reporting. I think we do that, right?
We do.
So tell us what our policy is and then kind of go through some of the reporting we do.
Our policy says when an officer uses force, he or she will submit a use of force report by the end of their next tour of duty. That has been in policy as long as I've been at the police department. We have mandated reports that the officers have to fill out. Anytime force is used, that has to be documented. Once that force is documented, then that goes through a 5-level review of supervision. It goes immediately to the officer supervisor, then to a shift lieutenant, then to the training lieutenant, then to the patrol or division commander, and then finally on my desk as the chief. All of the paperwork associated with the incident, all of the videos, whether it's a car video or a body camera video, is in the system and saved and locked and reviewed during this process.
Okay.
And so...
now, the 8 can't wait. When they say comprehensive reporting, are they just talking about use of force reporting, or are they talking about
from
some other
what I
kind of...
read online, it was specifically focused on use of force reporting. Are there agencies that maybe don't document use of force nationwide? Maybe. I don't know. I am not aware of the agencies in our surrounding area or really in our state.
Yeah.
I serve on a state board and interact with a lot of chiefs and other administrators, and I'm not aware of anybody that has no reporting of force.
It seems like you would have reporting.
Yeah. Well, it's been that way for a long time in our department. Another thing that we do, and it's probably a 50-50 split between agencies my guess in the state, is we mandate if our officers point a weapon at an individual, that is still a show of force, and we mandate that they fill out a report and document that incident. I remember being a young officer and thinking, well, I didn't hit them, I didn't have to do anything. Why should I have to write up something if I pointed a weapon and everything worked out fine? On this side of experience and maturity, one of the things that I see now is that as a track record where our officers are making good decisions, where our officers are showing force to try to stop a suspect's actions or gain compliance. The person does something, and our officers de-escalate and transition to the appropriate level of force. And so in my mind, it tracks those things and takes away some of that legal argument for an attorney of, well, you've never pulled your weapon, and it was the first time you ever pulled it, and so you just shot my client. Well, that's obviously attorneys make a lot of arguments, and that's some of their role in our court system. But we feel like that's important, and it's been that way at Lenoir ever since I started, in probably 30 years or more.
It seems like you said experience and maturity. I mean, unless you're a law enforcement officer and have been in a situation where you're experiencing this, I'm just sitting here thinking, I wonder how hard it is to remember everything that happens in situations like that are intense and confrontational. And do you remember, or is that just kind of like training and then, I did draw my weapon? Or
a lot of it is muscle memory and reaction, because we are reacting to what the individual is doing. I know I've never had to discharge my weapon, thankfully, in my career. The couple of times where I thought I may be getting ready to.
You probably remember that.
I do. I remember those situations, and they're very scary, and they're very fast. It happens very quickly, and your brain, and as your adrenaline starts to flow, you get a tunnel vision, and I experienced that. And officers are processing information at an extremely fast rate and making those decisions. But that's why you do training. Because with training, you are training your mind and your ability to handle that and be able to work through that adrenaline, fear to accomplish. Where realistically, where officers a lot of times struggle with it is after. Because that's when you think about it. After an incident, after a critical incident, that's when
you might second guess.
You have time to decompress, and you begin to think about, wow, well, what if it went this way? What if it went that way? But
there's
the moment,
there's no do-overs, right? You don't get do-overs.
We don't. Our officers have to be 100% of the time on their 100% A game, and we're humans, and sometimes we make mistakes, but I'm confident with the job our officers and law enforcement across the country does on a daily basis is an exceptional job with what they have to deal with and encounter.
Well, like we mentioned at the start of the discussion, you said, was it 2019, 33,000?
Yeah.
So 33,000 interactions just with the Lenoir Police Department in 2019.
Right.
And what'd you say, what were the 60-something?
61, 62.
And probably
I
less.
wish I'd have brought those numbers.
Yeah, probably less than that. Then, well, maybe we'll just put that up on the screen
there you go.
So people can see it. I mean, how's that not a good job? I mean, So I guess one more thing. Do you want to say anything to the public or to your officers or anything in general about?
It's a difficult time in our community, in our police department, and we're working through that together. I do feel like we are blessed in this community. We We did have 7 days of protest. They were all peaceful, and we respect that.
Let me interject there.
Yes.
And I think, was it Councilman Perdue who mentioned that the protests were peaceful, and a lot of that had to do with our residents who were
right.
peaceful, and that's a
right.
good thing. I mean,
that's absolutely correct, because they came, we interacted, and they had as much to do, probably the majority, rest on their shoulders as residents to keep it peaceful. And because we would have solely been reacting to what was occurring from the group. And so I do appreciate the willingness of the protesters and the people that came out to voice their concerns in a respectful and peaceful way. But I am always available if there is something that you feel like needs to be looked at, addressed. And I told many folks on the sidewalk during the week, not on the roadside. Do not argue with an officer on the side of the road. You follow their instructions, you follow their commands. The next morning, you call the police, you call the chief, you call a captain, and we will look into what occurred to make sure that our officers followed policy, followed North Carolina law, and handled it the right way. And there's times where, we see things that are coaching moments, and we take those, and we go forward with them, so we can learn from it.
And as the communications director and public information officer, I tell people all the time, I'm like, the City of Lenoir local government, we're open. We will answer questions. We will get you information. And I know that's the same with you. If people want you to come give a presentation, talk about these policies, answer questions.
Look forward to it.
Yeah.
I used to do a thing called Chat with the Chief. Chief Brown started it a couple years ago. I tried to carry it on, and I kind of ran into a problem with getting requests from folks to have me come. And so it kind of felt like, well, maybe the community doesn't feel like there's value there, and so stopped. So that's one of the things that I'm looking at starting back, and we're looking for other ways to engage the community.
Engagement ebbs, and
it does.
It rises and then lowers and then rises, and so we just have to be available for when the desire for engagement is on the rise. Then we're here to engage.
We've got a lot of programs that we've been doing for a number of years that we get to engage the community in. We don't always get a ton of participation, whether it's Citizens Police Academy, K-9 Academy. We do a program called Take a Kid Fishing that is a lot of fun in the spring. We do Coffee with a Cop. I know we have not done it in the last quarter due to COVID, but we're always looking for those interactions.
It's hard to drink coffee with a mask on.
It is. When there's nothing bad going on. I tell people in presentations, our officers don't get a call that there's a family of 4 having a great meal they want you to come by. A lot of times when we go to something bad's happened. Whether it's a wreck, whether it's a domestic, whether there's an issue, a neighbor dispute. And so we are always looking for those opportunities to interact with our community when there's nothing bad going on. And we can just interact and work on those relationships.
Brent, thank you.
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry. Chief Phelps.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Very welcome. Thank you for having me.